All right, should we move over to testing?
I think so. This is the best part here.
We test code?
I don't write tests.
Apparently I do. All right, so there is a good Wikipedia article out there. They don't sponsor us, but they have a software testing article. It's in the notes here. It goes through a ton of different types of tests. We're not going to...
If Wikipedia sponsored us, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I don't think they sponsor anyone. They want to be...
I donate to Wikipedia every year to keep them going. I do give back. All right, so, I mean, let's talk about why testing is important, right? I mean, this is going to sound really obvious, but...
Real quick before we move on, IDE is Integrated Development Environment, to answer that question in the chat.
Yes.
So it is, think more than just taking your text editor, so Notepad, adding a whole bunch of automation and buttons and things on top of it to make it do more for you.
Yeah, usually they'll compile the code for you.
They'll compile the code. They'll autocomplete imports. They'll tell you like common bugs, the styling and things like that. So it's everything.
Code complete sometimes. Auto-complete it. All right. So let's get back to testing. Why is it important, right? It sounds obvious, but wouldn't we rather find our own bugs first?
Your IDE will run your tests for you too.
There you go. If you have any.
If you have any. You have to have them first, yes.
And so there's a lot of studies, management, they love to go out and collect metrics. There's all kinds of studies that show the sooner we find a defect, the quicker it is to fix and the less expensive it is to fix. And so, from a realistic standpoint, think about it, right? If I find it while I'm building the software, I fix it, it's pretty easy. If my test team finds it before we deploy it to production, they're going to have to kick it back to development like we did in revision control last week, like that little tie together. That's fairly easy, depending on your process and how big your organization is. But now let's say it gets out to production, right? Now fixing a bug, let's say the users identify it, they engage. Now you're dealing with customer service, who then has to try to translate and reproduce it. And usually that reproducing process involves communication, tying back to one of our other modules. And usually we all know that communication is a big breakdown. And so it takes probably weeks to figure out what the problem is. And then it takes more time to go develop it, test it. And then, now we've got to push it out to production. So we've got to do a production deploy. So you see how this starts to grow in magnitude as it gets out there. So the sooner we find it, the easier it is to generally fix, right? And, God forbid, if your software is mission critical, I think, is it the Boeing 777 that had all the software issues? And it actually, they lost airplanes over that. And so, there could be broader impacts. If your software is mission critical, let's say, you're launching people into space or you're, doing other mission critical tasks, it could be very important. So we want to make sure it's tested. Think about yourself being, on board one of those planes or on some mission critical application that depends on it. So testing is important, and we want to make sure we're following those. So we've broken out like the different types of tests that we find are popular. Unit testing is our favorite from a developer standpoint because that is just dependent on ourselves. That's when we write our own code. Then we write unit tests to test our own code at the smallest pieces. Usually we want to test very small blocks of code. And I'll let you know a secret. People always come up to me and tell me that their code is hard to test. Okay. I don't disagree with that statement, but what I hear when they tell me that is they've written poor code. Poorly written code is hard to test, right? If you have no inputs and no outputs, there's nothing to test. Now, the solution to that, and I always have this conversation with people, is break down your code into more modules, more functions, more procedures, more classes, have those well-defined. If you can't write a quick 1 to 2 sentence description of what the current module or function is trying to perform with inputs and outputs, if you start writing a novel, then you probably need to break it down and break that novel down, take 2 sentences and try to break it down into pieces. And then it's easier to test too, because when you have a small little bit of function, now you have a small little narrow bit of testing to do, right? When you have this giant paragraph, there's all these if, then, else, buts, and tests in there, and your tests grow actually exponentially. It doesn't grow linearly, right? And so that's what I love to have that discussion about unit testing. If anybody struggle with unit testing, please reach out. We would love to help talk through that. But unit testing is just the start. Now it gets really interesting. You can be a great unit tester, and this is where, Julio and I love to talk about. Julio and I can go write some great code, but when we get together and we do integration testing, which we're testing the code together, we have not typically communicated properly. And so both of our individual units are working properly as designed, but we didn't design them to collaborate properly. We didn't talk through the details of the collaboration. So integration testing often runs into problems. So the earlier you can start doing your integration testing and forcing that communication to happen, the better it's going to be when you start doing the integration testing. If you wait till the end and try to do integration testing of 100 different modules, it's going to be a struggle. So start trying to, think of building Legos. Start building them as early as possible. Start the integration as early as possible. Okay.
Typically, the integration testing we'll do as part of the development lifecycle. We'll have a developer go and write their unit tests and then also write the integration test at the same time. So that way, when they have a reviewer looking at it, they can see the interaction of these things. And sometimes the integration testing is broader and you'll have a separate set of things to go and do for it. The other thing to note as we go through these next couple ones too, in unit and integration specifically, is there's overlap. There's not a clear defined, this is unit, this is integration. I mean, you can argue a bunch of different ways that a test is both a unit or an integration test. The key thing is having tests.
I was going to say, I find myself arguing that we just don't have them.
Yeah.
I've never had an argument about identifying what it is. It's just, where is it?
Yeah. I'd rather have tests that are useful and provide confidence in the code that we're covering the different conditions that we want to.
Well, that's where I hate code coverage, right? Is I see too many. I personally can write some pretty crappy tests, have 100% code coverage, but not actually do good testing. And so we have to be careful about code coverage. Make sure we're doing good testing. We're going to talk through an example in a minute about that too.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. So integration testing is just, hey, let's start testing things and putting it together as early as possible, right? And as Julio said, some of that might include unit tests, and so, but then we get up to system testing, and this is really the end-to-end testing, right? And I feel remiss if I don't say you should have some sort of test environment. I don't know what you call it, but it's not production, right? Testing in production is not the way we should go. You want to have a separate environment where you can test, model things, make it as close to production as possible, get realistic data in there. But don't test in production, please. Like, I can't tell you enough how much I see that.
I still, to this day, see developers who just make changes in production. They develop new code and add it straight to production. They don't use another environment, any other environment.
Well, we were working with another company the other day, and we got an email about accessing the production environment. And so Julio graciously responded and said, "Well, we could give you a copy because I'm sure you want to test this in some other environment."
Yeah, and
they were like, nudge.
Yeah, and they were like, "Oh, I guess that would be a good idea too." We're like,
because we knew right away that they were going to test it in production. So it's just gently nudge people. And so system testing, you want to do end-to-end testing, not in production, and that way you can plan. And then it might shock you, but you should probably plan your deployment and test your deployment. So blow away the environment or load your production onto that test environment, and then try your deployment. And here's a novel idea. If it fails, do it again until you do it without failing. Okay.
Yeah, that's one of the best things you can do. Like, if you have a small project, your own personal project, like you're just testing something, you have your production server and that's it. You don't want to spend a lot of money. Just download the data, download a copy of your production data and all the assets that are associated with it, and just run it locally on your own machine against your code and just see that it works. That's a really great way to go and just make sure that, hey, a new release, especially if you have to make changes to your database or some sort of core structure, having that testing process beforehand is essential.
Yeah. Now, I will advocate that if you're going to do it in a production environment where your job depends on it, I would love to see that testing environment, a new environment, not your current machine, because there's too many times we forget to check in a file or do something that's a little different locally.
Well, that too.
And we want to be able to test it. But
there's also security considerations and compliance. You can't do that. I'm not going to say you should do that for everything. I mean, pulling down.
Just testing it. Like that's a start, right?
Yeah, just testing it is a start. But if you have certain compliances, like you have to deal with credit card data or health data, well, that starts to get a little bit more complicated and out
don't
the scope.
That.
Yes, please don't download that.
But yeah, I mean, just test it, right? And then, as you do more and more deployments, you'll learn the ins and outs of failed deployments, and they can really hurt. So test your deployment as well. So we talk a little bit next about performance testing, load testing, and security testing, right? I'm a little passionate about these in terms of they frustrate me. Make sure you do your unit integration system testing first. If you don't have performance requirements, then don't do performance testing unless performance is a problem. I've seen too many developers, worry about optimizing code that doesn't need to be optimized. If you want to do that, go out in the parking lot, take a lighter, take $100 bill, and just burn it, right? We're essentially wasting time and energy.
I actually, an interesting thing, I had to write a serverless application this week with AWS Lambda. That is a case where, hey, you have to optimize everything you do because you pay for how much CPU, how much time, and how much memory it uses. So optimization is important. You get that savings by it being cheap if you optimize it. But if you're building a Java application that runs on a server that you're just paying for every month, and it's $20 a month, and you just get to use all the memory there, don't go optimizing it until you start having a problem or start identifying that, hey, I'm using more and more memory. Maybe I should figure out why. And you don't need to make something go from 200 microseconds to 200 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds.
1 nanosecond.
Yeah. It doesn't help anything.
So I will say one of the most common problems I see in the software development environment when we do testing is, Julio mentioned testing on his laptop or testing on his computer, whatever it is. He's got some crazy fancy desktop, but we'll ignore that for the moment. One of the biggest problems I see from a developer standpoint is we don't load enough data, right? Is we'll create a blank database of some sorts, or we'll load 100 records in the database. And then when we go to production after about a month, we get 1 million records and everything starts to fall apart because we didn't index the database properly or we didn't handle the load right. So make sure you put the proper amount of data and you're handling and testing with, probably I would usually try to do 110% of what you would expect in your current production environment. So you're always leaning forward and ahead of that. That's one of the most common performance and load kind of testing that I see missed. Now, again, get ahead of that, but don't be 10 times the load because you want to see where it's at. As a manager, I get really frustrated when my team spends weeks and weeks working on things that just don't matter, and then there's all these problems left unsolved. So I see a lot of people working on performance testing where they don't need to. And then security testing, I'll say this from Julio's very passionate about security, but I think it's one of the things that we never do, right? And we should do if we have security requirements. So if you have security requirements, make sure you are testing security, because those are one of the things that if somebody else tests it and finds out that there's a hole in it, you'll usually look like a big idiot. And the last thing you want your users doing is
that's the
finding
best case
out
that you look like a big idiot.
Yeah,
I mean, there's far worse.
You end up on the news, and that could be even worse.
Yes, yeah. There's security testing is one thing that, hey, if you put authentication in place, maybe you should check that somebody can't step around it. And
you don't get a mulligan on those.
Yeah, no, you don't.
So anyway, so be cognizant. If you don't have security requirements, then you don't need security testing. But if you have security requirements, if you have any PII, HIPAA, or any of those, make sure you're doing the reasonable checks to comply with those. We actually use a lot of tools to do some of those scans and stuff for us to make sure that we're compliant, because a second set of eyes always helps. And so when you're testing, that is another point, right? You should be the first set of eyes. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing testing is I like to go to bed, sleep on it, right, and come in the next morning and then write my tests. Because when you're writing software, it's really hard to find defects because it's in your mind. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but I've written tons of emails that when somebody read them back to me, it wasn't what I thought it was because I'm reading it, looking at it, and in my mind, I'm scrolling it through.
I do that all of the time where you're thinking one thing, but you type something completely different, or what you're trying to say just doesn't come through.
And so after a good night's sleep, you're kind of fresh. Unlike me this morning, I walked in this morning and Julio was like, "Oh man, you're struggling."
And Brian looks like he's hurting, staying up too late.
Yeah, and my wife has me on this new running regimen, which she is probably trying to kill me or something. But after a fresh night's sleep, you can look at your code, and I've done this before. I'll come in, but I wrote that. That's pretty poor. And so then you can actually test it better. And then, once you get your test done, I would advocate always having a test team or a different set of eyes, code review, have someone help you with the test because they're going to always see things that you don't see. And so that we collectively don't get better, as you probably get tired of me saying this, without collaborating with other people. Julio constantly pushes me and makes me a better person and vice versa. So you have to have that collaboration and that feedback loop to grow. All right, so should we talk a little bit more in detail about writing a good unit test? I feel like,
Nah, we don't need to write good unit tests.
Prescriptive if we didn't talk about like the hows of it.
It's easy to say write tests, but what
is
a
good test, right?
Yes.
Good test, right? A good test. So I think we have to be more prescriptive about that. And so we like to use the absolute value function, and I know I can see it getting ready to be written in the chat. There is a math function, so you don't need to actually write this, but this is the easy one to talk about an example so that we can all do this in the morning. And so let's talk about writing the absolute value test, and more importantly, let's talk about testing it and how we would test it, right? And so, let's look at the input as an integer, not a floating point number. We will be here till the sun comes up talking about edge cases. And so what are the tests that we have to do to write for this? The minimal set of tests. Okay, has anybody ever thought of that? I'm going to pull up my chat window here. Hold on, bear with me.
And just as a reminder, the absolute value is, if somebody needs a little bit of jogging, it's been a little bit since you've had math, it should take in a number, and any number, and for our argument here, we're using an integer value, so 1, 5, 20, or a negative number, and tell you what the absolute value, what the distance from 0 is. So the number 1 and the number -1 both should return 1. So.
Oh yeah. Hold on, I just screwed that one up.
So if we're using an integer,
there we go.
You trying to get the chat up there, Brian?
Yeah, I was trying.
Do you have your
horrible
laptop muted so it doesn't blare out audio?
No, I don't, and I wasn't trying.
So if you guys could go ahead and, if you haven't already, put in some values you think that we should test.
I have too many windows open. I thought I closed them. There we go. All right. Apparently I have 400 Chrome things open here. Sorry, guys.
You're wondering why your laptop's crawling.
Yeah, Julio's always yelling at me. I just keep opening new tabs.
Yeah, Brian asked me. He's like, "Man, my laptop's really slow," and he has a top of the end laptop because I know he's a bad user. He goes and
Julio bought it, so he knows the specs.
Yeah, it's good, and plenty of other people have the same laptop, and they have no problems with it. I never hear complaints. It works perfectly fine. But Brian always has problems. I literally come over one day, and he says, "Can you help me and look at my laptop? Why is it running so slow?" It's like, well, Brian, you have like 35 Chrome tabs open, and then you have like this other application running. I was like, maybe you should close a couple.
There's my downloads folder. I couldn't download anything anymore.
Yeah, and I was like, let's just delete that.
And like 10,000 files.
Close Chrome.
Apparently, there's a limit.
Yeah. So, all right. So some of the some answers are coming in here for what we should test. So Oliver said -1, 0, and 1. What are your thoughts on those, Brian?
Nice. That's a good start. Why not -3?
Why not -10?
Yeah.
What about -30?
Yeah.
Well,
3 is my favorite number. We'll use 3.
I will say, as a developer, I don't like. I like writing tests. I like having the confidence of having tests that they'll work correctly and that my code does what I expect it to. but I don't want to write like tests forever. So you definitely, I don't think we need to go and put -10 or 10 if we have 3 and -3. I think 0 is perfect. It's just a boundary number.
So that's the key, right? Essentially, we really are looking for boundaries.
So right? Different types of boundaries.
Yeah. So for unit testing, you're trying to identify all
a
the
normal
boundaries.
case and then boundaries.
Yeah. Well, and even the normal case are considered boundaries, right? So 0 in itself, that's a great one because it is a special case, especially in math. 0 is always considered a boundary condition. So ultimately, for testing, we're looking for the boundaries. Where do things change?
Yep. So Alexander brought up another one here. Perhaps testing integer overflow values in case incorrect input is passed. That's certainly if you're using a language where that could happen. Absolutely. So
let's adjust it for him. I think he's on to a good point. So min and max int.
Yep.
Right. So those are the ultimate, left and right boundaries. We'll say min and max boundaries. So those are edge cases in itself, right? So min and max int, those are 2 edge cases. So that's perfect.
Yep.
Right. And then as we move in from, whatever the 2 to the x power is, as we move in, right, we're coming closer and closer to the plus and minus 1, right? And plus and minus 1 are other boundary conditions because weird things happen at 1 with math. And so those are your other boundary conditions.
Yep.
And then as you move inside of 1, what happens? 0. So those are your 5 boundary conditions, right? And so the point is so 0, 1 and -1, min and max int are the boundaries. And so when you're testing, you want to just look for those boundaries where things transition. You want to test the transition points because nothing will change in the deep sea of the non-transition places.
You don't need to test 1 million and -1 million.
Now I will say there are some instances. I mean, if we change this from an integer input to a floating point integer, as you approach 1, as you approach -1, you start getting the number of test conditions rise exponentially.
Yep.
So there are going to be instances where it's just there's almost an infinite amount of tests to do, and so you have to figure out. I like to say write the minimal amount of tests where you feel like you're productive, because if you feel like you're just writing tests to write them, again, let's take a $100 bill, go out to the parking lot, and we can burn it. And once you're into that mindset, you're not adding value, right? And I will say, management can ruin us. I had a manager come up to me and they're going to start taking metrics on lines of code and number of tests. Well, just tell me the amount of tests I need. I can produce them, trust me, right? And tell me the amount of lines of code I need. I can write lines of code. I didn't say they'll do anything productive, but if you're going to judge me on metrics, I can produce metrics to look like anything you want. And so we have to be careful about metrics and how we put them in front of teams. So I'm very cautious about metrics and really more about, hey, let's be productive. Let's add value. As soon as you feel like you're not adding value, just stop writing tests, right? You'll know it, right? You should know it right away.
And as a junior engineer, you should definitely talk to others on your team if you're not sure what these boundary conditions are. If you're writing something that does
0 tests.
Yeah. You definitely don't. The 0 test is not the way you want to go. You would definitely want to have some sort of tests, but talk to your team to figure out what are these boundary conditions. What should you consider, especially if you're new to an application that has a lot of history on it. There could be use cases. It's never going to be as simple. I mean, unless you're writing an absolute value function, which you probably shouldn't be doing, but it's not going to be 0, -1 to 1 in min and max int. It's going to be some weird edge case with the data coming in with this different value in it versus this other value that you have to test for.
Well, and that's where, without getting off my horse too much here, is that's where we developers have to understand the business. And we have to start to understand what they're doing. And it helps us be better developers in terms of writing the code, understanding the outcomes, and also testing. And so we have to spend time to learn and understand that. And the other thing is, participate in code reviews, because not only are you giving feedback, but you'd be amazed how much you learn by seeing what other people are doing. You gain context, you gain awareness. I encourage the most junior members of our team to do code reviews because they often surprise me with phenomenal feedback. They catch things that nobody else catches because they're looking at things that differently. And so, but at the same time, they're gaining insight into broader things that the team are doing. So those are very unique ways to leverage good practices to perform ancillary, unrelated tasks that will benefit the entire team. So as we move down, we have mocks and stubs.
Yeah, so these are mocks and stubs are a good way to, hey, I'm writing a test and I want to write something that I have some complicated conversion logic that changes this one object to another object and does some computation in it before it saves it to the database. Well, how do I just want to test this logic here. I don't really want to test my saving to the database because I know that works, or you're using some other library that you at least think works. You're going to reliably trust it for the sake of your unit test. And so the concept of stubs and mocks are ways to implement that functionality or hide that functionality from your test so that you can isolate your test more effectively. I'll say that there's overlap again with testing. There's a lot of overlapping concepts between things. Stubs are if you were to go and have an interface and you just write a stub that just doesn't do anything and you just have that class there. A mock is similar to that, but is more typically a framework that allows you to dynamically add functionality to an interface or to an existing class that you don't have an interface for. The long and the short, both of them allow you to go and hide the functionality, add really limited functionality behind like a saving to the database. You don't actually want to stand up a database or have sample data or things like that. You just want to test this conversion logic. You can write a mock that says, hey, I expect this value to come in, and I'm just going to return this value back. And then the key thing with stubs and mocks are that they shouldn't be your sole set of tests. If everything is just mocked and stubbed out, you're not going to get the value out of your test.
I've seen these mocks that are like 15 pages of setup. That's too much.
Yeah, you don't need really a massive amount of mocks. I'll say typically mocks and stubs are good for really complicated areas where, you want to isolate functionality. But nowadays, with how testing frameworks have expanded and are more readily available and usable in the open source, it's easy for you to go in and stand up a lot of things in your test to make your test more usable. A really great example of this is the concept of using test containers. This is something we do in our applications where it stands up a Docker container of our Mongo database or our MySQL database or whatever else the services we need. So that way in our tests, we don't have to mock out the calls to the database. We can write a test right to it with no extra real headache at all.
I assume you're loading those with a preset data.
Yep. So yeah, you go and you just load it with the data that you know. So like there's again.
And as you find new conditions, you could add new data.
Exactly.
One of the other random things that I kind of, probably I'm out on my own island here, but I loved mocking to test exception handling. Because a lot of times we found there was oddities in how we handled certain exceptions. So I love to write some of the exception handling testing just to make sure that, honestly, the biggest thing is to make sure we are properly capturing failures so that we could properly identify.
Well, handling the propagation of them, making sure that your code does what it wants to, or what you need it to do. One of the things, I guess, a lesson learned that I tried to do at one point was testing various log messages that got logged during exception handling. I wouldn't recommend that. That gets a little bit too over.
You get tired of the copy paste log messages?
Yeah. If you have to copy and paste the message every time, it's not really that great of a test.
Well, what I found is a lot of people copy and paste code, and then the logs come along for free, and then the log message has nothing to do with the code anymore.
Yeah.
And so then you're like, and then you find the original log message, and you think the problem's there, and you, after spending a week of trying to solve a non-existent problem in that area, you'll quickly start looking for those. But anyway, I digress. All right, so we have a little note in here about test-driven development. I'm not really a big advocate personally about test-driven development. I'm really more of an advocate that we do testing, right? And I think there's cases to be made that test-driven development would work in those cases, and that's fine. It's like anything. Use and make those decisions as you arrive to them. I think as long as you're performing good testing, whether you do it initially or after, it doesn't matter to me. I'm just going to be thankful it's happening.
I think in the case of any of these, even with like things that we do follow, like Agile. Test-driven development is something that you can take bits and pieces from and apply to what it is you're doing.
Or you don't even follow Agile to the letter of the law.
Exactly. Again, you have to you have to take what works for your team, for your customers, for your problem, and combine these things together to come up with a solution. There, you can't just prescribe like a one-size-fits-all for everything. So test-driven development, I say would be it's good if your team's all senior developers who know the business really well. I think it's better to think of it as more business-driven testing development, in that you should write tests that solve your business use cases. And if you need to go and write the code first to understand what it's even going to do, because you don't understand what it needs to do first, how are you going to write tests for it at the end? Now, if you know that, hey, I want to go and build an API that has these endpoints and does these things, and then maybe writing a test beforehand might be beneficial just to make your life easier.
Well, and the key here too is you're doing the things that work for you, but don't eliminate the things you don't like, right? It isn't about, a la carte choosing things you do and don't like, because, ultimately you have to figure out what actually gets the best results. And that's the concept of, retrospection. So, don't cut out the things you don't like, because those might be the things that are the most productive. Oftentimes, the things we dislike are the things that are helping us the most. So figure out what truly does and doesn't work and why they don't work, and then eliminate them for those reasons. I find too many people eliminate things they don't like, which is unit testing. And so we want to keep the things that are and aren't working, and why. Ask why, really. Like, get down in and figure out the whys, and eliminate the things that aren't working and figure out why they're not working and improve upon them, because you may need them, like unit tests. I can write ineffective unit tests. Well, we still need them. So why aren't they working? Well, they're ineffective. So let's write effective unit tests, rather than just say, well, since they're not working, we'll stop doing it, right? If you don't like food, you're going to stop eating. I didn't think so, right? All right.
So let us know in the comments if you have any questions about testing. There's some things we didn't even talk about in here. Test automation.
We could talk for days about testing.
Yeah.
The goal is to get you interested in it,
not
scare you away.
Another great area that we didn't talk about that maybe, Brian, if you want to add a note for it, is end-to-end testing or user testing. So using something like Selenium or Cypress. If you're building a web application, and even I think there's tools for this for desktop applications, but having a way to automate functions that if you're building your own little web app in free time and you want the best bang for the buck tests, I would say that would be your Selenium or end-to-end tests, where you're going in and clicking the login button, clicking over to the tab, doing X, Y, and Z in the application, is going to provide the most value especially for your side projects and things like that, to make sure that things don't break, or even a school project. If you're building a web app, I would definitely recommend nowadays. Cypress is really great for that. Selenium has a lot of value and a lot more flexibility, but Cypress is definitely expanding out. So those are definitely an area I would check out.
Yeah, nothing's more embarrassing than having either broken links or buttons that don't work in your application, because
there's just some sort of regression.
Simply has to push the button, right?
Yep.
It's a really hard argument with management that like nobody tested the button. Like, just press the button, not like this. Press these things, stand on your head, and do all 10 activities. Like, those are different cases. So make sure you have the bare minimum, because it's embarrassing when you don't.